For what purpose does the gentlelady from Texas rise?
Speaker, pursuant to Clause 2A1 of Rule 9, I rise to give notice of my intent to raise a question of the privileges of the House. The form of the resolution is as follows.
Mr. Speaker, the House is not in order.
The House will be in order. I'd ask members on the minority side to take their conversations off the floor. Gentlelady from Texas is recognized.
Raising a question of the privileges of the House. Whereas the chair of the Committee on Oversight and Government Reform has interfered with the work of an independent agency and pressured an administrative law judge of the National Labor Relations Board by compelling the production of documents related to an ongoing case, something independent experts said could seriously undermine the authority of those charged with enforcing the nation's labor laws, and which the House Ethics Manual discourages by noting that federal courts have nullified administrative decisions on grounds of due process and fairness towards all of the parties when congressional interference with ongoing administrative proceedings may have unduly influenced the outcome. Whereas the chair of the Committee on Oversight and Government Reform has politicized investigations by rolling back long-standing bipartisan precedents, including by authorizing subpoenas without the concurrence of the ranking member or a committee vote, by refusing to share documents and other information with the ranking member, and restricting the minority's right to call witnesses at hearings. Whereas the chair of the Committee on Oversight and Government Reform has jeopardized ongoing criminal investigation by publicly releasing documents that his own staff has admitted were under court seal. Whereas the chair of the Committee on Oversight and Government Reform has unilaterally subpoenaed a witness who is expected to testify at an upcoming federal trial, despite long-standing precedent and objections from the Department of Justice that such a step could cause complications of a trial and potentially jeopardize a criminal conviction. Whereas the chair of the Committee on Oversight and Government Reform is engaged in expression of confusion through the use of repeated incorrect and uncorroborated statements in the committee's fast and furious investigation. Whereas the chair of the Committee on Oversight and Government Reform has chosen to call the Attorney General of the United States a liar on national television without corroborating evidence, and has exhibited behavior which could result in jeopardizing an ongoing committee investigation into Operation Fast and Furious. Therefore, it be resolved that the House of Representatives disapproves of the behavior of this chair for interfering with ongoing criminal investigations, insisting on a personal attack against the Attorney General of the United States, and for calling the Attorney General of the United States a liar on national television without corroborating evidence, thereby discredits to the integrity of the House.
Under Rule 9, a resolution offered from the floor by a member other than the majority leader or the minority leader as a question of the privileges of the House has immediate precedence only at a time designated by the chair within 2 legislative days after the resolution is properly noticed. Pending that designation, the form of the resolution noticed by the gentlelady from Texas will appear in the record at this point. The chair will not at this point determine whether the resolution constitutes a question of privilege. That determination will be made at the time designated for consideration of the resolution. What purpose the gentleman from California rise?
Mr. Speaker, by direction of the Committee on Rules, I call up House Report Number 112-546.
The clerk will report the title of the report.
House Calendar Number 140, report to accompany resolution recommending that the House of Representatives find Eric H. Holder, Jr., Attorney General, U.S. Department of Justice, in contempt of Congress for refusal to comply with a subpoena duly issued by the Committee on Oversight and Government Reform.
Pursuant to House Resolution 708, the report is considered read. For what purpose does the gentleman from California, Mr. Issa, seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, by direction of the Committee on Rules, I call up House Resolution 711.
The clerk will report the title of the resolution.
House Resolution 711, resolution recommending that the House of Representatives find Eric H. Holder, Jr., Attorney General, U.S. Department of Justice, in contempt of Congress for refusal to comply with a subpoena duly issued by the Committee on Oversight and Government Reform.
Pursuant to House Resolution 708, the resolution is considered read and shall be debatable for 50 minutes, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking member of the Committee on Oversight and Government Reform or their designee. After debate on the resolution, it shall be in order to consider a motion to refer it, if offered by the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Dingell, or his designee, which shall be debatable for 10 minutes, equally divided and controlled by the proponent or an opponent. The gentleman from California, Mr. Issa, and the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Cummings, will each control 25 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days within which to revise and extend their remarks and insert extraneous material into the record for both resolutions made in order under the rule.
Without objection, so ordered. Gentleman from California is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I recognize myself, or yield myself, 2 minutes.
Gentleman is recognized for 2 minutes. The gentleman will suspend. The House will be in order. Gentleman from California is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I never thought we would be here today. I never thought this point would come. Throughout 18 months of investigation, through countless areas of negotiations in order to get the minimum material necessary to find out the facts behind Fast and Furious and the murder of Border Patrol agent Brian Terry, I always believed that in time we would reach an accommodation sufficient to get the information needed for the American people, while at the same time preserving the ongoing criminal investigations. I'm proud to say that our committee has maintained the ability for the Justice Department to continue their ongoing prosecutions. Neither the majority nor minority has allowed any material to become public that could compromise that. However, the facts remain. Fast and Furious, the Department of Justice permitted sale of more than 2,000 weapons that fell into the hands of the Mexican drug cartels, was both reckless and inexcusable. And it clearly was known by people, both career professionals and political appointees, from the lowliest member on the ground in Phoenix to high-ranking officials in the Department of Justice. But that's not what we're here for today. Today, we're here on a very narrow contempt, one that the Speaker of the House, in his wisdom and assistance, has helped us to fashion. Let it be clear, we still have unanswered questions on a myriad of areas related to Operation Fast and Furious. But today we are only here to determine, over the 10 months from the time in which the American people and the Congress of the United States was lied to, given false, literally the reverse, statement that no guns were allowed to walk, during that 10 months before the Justice Department finally owned up and recognized that they had to come clean, that in fact Fast and Furious was all about gun walking, the Department of Justice maintained a series of documents. Many of these documents are believed to be communications between and with the very individuals at the heart of the decision to go forward with Fast and Furious. Therefore, we have focused our limited contempt on those documents. If our committee is able to receive the documents in totality that show who brought about the dishonest statement to Congress and who covered it up for 10 months, we believe that will allow us to backtrack to the individuals who ultimately believed in Fast and Furious, facilitated Fast and Furious, and ultimately made it responsible for Brian Terry's death. I yield myself an additional 15 seconds.
Gentleman is recognized for 15 seconds.
I won't read everything that's in my opening statement. I will read just one more thing. These words were said on the House floor in 2008 when Speaker Pelosi supported contempt. She said, Congress has a responsibility of oversight of the executive branch. I know that members on both sides of the aisle take the responsibility very seriously. Oversight is an institutional obligation to ensure against abuse of power. Subpoena authority is a vital tool of that oversight. Speaker Pelosi, 2008. I reserve the balance of my time.
Time of the gentleman has expired. Gentleman from Maryland.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman from Maryland is recognized for as much time as he may consume.
Today, Mr. Speaker, is a historic day in many ways. On the one hand, in a landmark decision by Chief Justice John Roberts, the Supreme Court upheld the health care bill, ensuring that millions of American families will finally have access to effective and affordable health care. On the other hand, the Republican leaders of the House of Representatives are about to plunge into the history books as some of the most extreme and partisan ever. Rather than working together in a bipartisan way to create jobs and help our nation's economic recovery, they're rushing to the floor under emergency procedures with a contempt resolution that is riddled with errors and motivated by partisan politics. When I first heard about the allegations of gun walking at ATF, I was outraged. I fully supported our committee's goals of finding out how it started, how it was used, and how it may have contributed to the death of Border Patrol Agent Brian Terry. I made a personal commitment, which I will keep, to the Terry family to conduct a responsible and thorough inquiry. But today's contempt vote is a culmination of one of the most highly politicized and reckless congressional investigations in decades. After receiving thousands of pages of documents from the Justice Department, conducting 24 transcribed interviews, and hearing testimony from the Attorney General 9 times, here are the facts. First, the committee has obtained no evidence that the Attorney General authorized, condoned, or knew about gun walking. Chairman Issa admitted this just yesterday before the Rules Committee. We've seen no evidence that the Attorney General lied to Congress or engaged in a cover-up. We've seen no evidence that the White House had anything to do with the gun walking operations. Chairman Issa admitted this on Fox News Sunday this past weekend. Democrats wanted a real investigation, but Chairman Issa refused 10 different requests to hold a hearing with the director of ATF, the agency that ran these misguided operations. Let me say that again. During this entire investigation, no member of the House has been able to pose a single question to the head of ATF at a public hearing. How can you have a credible investigation of gun walking at ATF and never hold a single hearing with the leadership of the agency in charge? The answer is you can't. Based on the documents, we now know that gun walking, in fact, started in 2006. Yesterday, Chairman Issa said this about the misguided operations during the Bush administration, and I quote, "They were all flops. They were all failures," end of quote. The committee has obtained documentary evidence that former Attorney General Mukasey was personally briefed on these botched interdiction efforts during his tenure, and that he was told they would be expanded. Chairman Issa refused to call Mr. Mukasey for a hearing or even for a private meeting. During our committee's year-and-a-half investigation, the chairman refused every single Democratic request for a witness. Instead of taking any of these reasonable steps as part of a credible and even-handed investigation to determine the facts, House Republican leaders rushed this resolution to the floor only 1 week after it was voted out of committee. In contrast, during the last Congress, House leaders continued to negotiate for 6 months to try to avoid contempt in the United States Attorney's investigation. Mr. Speaker, some of my colleagues on the other side seem almost giddy about today's vote. After turning this investigation into an election year witch hunt, they somehow convinced the Speaker to take it to the floor. And they are finally about to get the prize they have been seeking for more than a year, holding the Attorney General of the United States of America in contempt. They may view today's vote as a success, but in reality, it is a sad failure. A failure of House leadership, a failure of our constitutional obligations, and a failure of our responsibilities to the American people. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Maryland reserves. The gentleman from California.
The gentleman from, well, I'll leave his statement where it lay. I now yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Pennsylvania, the distinguished Congressman Meehan, a former U.S. attorney in that district.
The gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, this is not about politics, though there are some, if they want to suggest that it is, because if they yell loud enough and long enough, it'll deflect the truth of the matter. And frankly, it's not about gotcha. As a former prosecutor myself, the Attorney General personifies the pursuit of justice, and I want to see him do well. But it is about accountability. Agent Brian Terry is dead, protecting our border, and 563 days later, the Terry family still does not know why it occurred. What they do know is that the very agency that initiated Fast and Furious, the Department of Justice under Attorney General Eric Holder, called the operation fatally flawed, and then the wagons got circled. It's about the separation of powers. As uncomfortable as it may be, at times it's a fundamental tenet and a strength of our democracy that Congress is given not just the power, but the responsibility to exercise its duty of executive over the oversight over the executives, especially when, by their own admission, things have gone glaringly wrong. Because the Justice Department has stubbornly resisted the legitimate inquiries of Congress over Operation Fast and Furious, there's so much we do not know. But because whistleblowers within the Department of Justice were outraged at the mischaracterizations, there's a great deal that we do know. What we do know is that we have been dealing with a systematic effort to deflect attention away from the decisions and the determinations that were made at the highest levels of the Department of Justice, where information was brought directly to individuals at the highest level of the Department of Justice, information that was contained in wiretap affidavits that lay out in explicit detail the matters related to Fast and Furious. Mr. Speaker, there is a famous quotation in the Department of Justice about the responsibility of the Attorney General not being to win cases, but to assure that justice is pursued and retained. Mr. Speaker, it is incumbent and a responsibility on this House to do what is required to do in this circumstance and to support the request that we be given the documents to obtain the facts that will allow us to draw the conclusions which I believe will allow us to get to the bottom of this level. Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. The gentleman from Maryland.
Mr. Speaker, I yield the distinguished gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Quigley, 2 minutes.
The gentleman from Illinois is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Those bringing this contempt vote say they want to talk about gun walking and how to stop it. Okay, let's have that conversation. They say they want to stop gun trafficking and keep our ATF agents safe. Well then, let's properly fund the ATF, which is the same number of agents since 1970. They say they want to stop gun trafficking. Well then, appoint a permanent ATF director, which the agency hasn't had in 6 years. They say they want to stop gun trafficking. Well then, let's pass some laws which actually deter straw purchasers. Straw purchasers can currently buy thousands of AK-47s, lie on their paperwork, and the penalty is equivalent to a moving violation. They say they want to stop gun trafficking. Well then, let's give the agents to feel what they've been asking for, the ability to track multiple purchases of long guns. These long guns include AK-47s, variant assault weapons, and 50 caliber semi-automatic sniper rifles, the weapons of choice for international drug cartels. They say they want to stop gun trafficking. Well then, let's close the gun show loophole, which currently allows anyone to purchase any gun they want without a background check. Felons, domestic violence abusers, those with severe mental illness, even those on the terrorist watch list can currently walk into a gun show and purchase any gun they want. Yes, 2,000 guns were allowed to walk to Mexico, but the truth is tens of thousands of guns flow across our border every year because of those lax gun laws. But those bringing this contempt vote don't want to have this conversation, and they aren't serious about stopping gun trafficking. They simply want to embarrass the administration, even though the committee's 16-month investigation found no evidence the Attorney General knew about gun walking, and even though there was no evidence the White House involvement in gun walking, all of which Chairman Issa admitted on national TV last week. So if we're going to talk about gun trafficking, let's be clear. This is about politics, not safety. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. The gentleman from California.
Mr. Speaker, the minority knows that, in fact, this contempt is all about the Attorney General's refusal to turn over documents, not whether or not it was his lieutenants or he that personally was involved in Fast and Furious. With that, I'd like to recognize the distinguished former chairman of the Judiciary Committee, the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Sensenbrenner, for 2 minutes.
The gentleman from Wisconsin is recognized for 2 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, this isn't about politics. This is about the Constitution, and it's about Congress's mandate to do oversight over both the executive and judicial branches of government. Now, the President is asserting executive privilege to attempt to shield these documents, and he is relying on a type of privilege called the deliberative process privilege. However, that privilege disappears when Congress is investigating evidence of wrongdoing. And in 1997, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit wrote in part, "Moreover, the privilege disappears altogether when there is any reason to believe that government misconduct has occurred." In another case that was decided by the First Circuit in 1995, it says that the grounds that shielding internal government deliberations in this context does not serve the public interest in honest, effective government. There's been misconduct that's already a matter of public record in 2 instances. The Justice Department wrote Senator Grassley in January of 2011, saying that the ATF sanctioned gun walking across the border was false. And it took them 9 months to retract that letter. So they misled Congress, and then 9 months later they said, oops, maybe we did mislead Congress and we'll withdraw the letter. And in May 2011, the Attorney General testified before the Judiciary Committee that he first heard of Operation Fast and Furious a few weeks before the hearing. Over 6 months later, he conceded that he should have said a few months. Now, this very clearly shows that Congress has got the obligation to get to the bottom of this, and that the assertion of executive privilege by the President and the Attorney General is not based in law. We ought to go ahead and do our job and do our oversight, and it's too bad that the Justice Department has decided to try to obstruct Congress's ability to do it. Pass the resolution.
The time of the gentleman has expired. The gentleman from Maryland.
I yield to the gentleman and member of the committee, Mr. Connolly of Virginia, 2 minutes.
Gentleman from Virginia is recognized for 2 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, the 112th Congress is on the verge of becoming the first in the history of the country to hold a sitting cabinet member in contempt, cementing its legacy as the most partisan House of Representatives perhaps of all time. When they say it's not about politics, you can be sure it's about politics. The majority's irresponsible and unprecedented contempt vote brings dishonor to this House, which has become so clouded in judgment, so besotted with rancor and partisanship that it's incapable of addressing a fundamental separation of powers conflict in a serious and fair fashion. In refusing to engage in good faith negotiations with the Department of Justice and the Attorney General, the majority has exposed this contempt citation for what it really is, an extraordinarily shameful political witch hunt aimed at trashing an honorable man. It's unacceptable. We're rushing to the floor. This unprecedented contempt resolution. Yesterday, Ranking Member Cummings sent a letter to the Speaker highlighting 100 errors, omissions, mischaracterizations of fact contained in the contempt citation itself, rushed out of our committee last week on a party line vote. Although some of the contempt citation's flaws are simply misleading, others are significant legal deficiencies and may contain factual errors that call into question the very validity of the contempt citation itself. For example, on pages 4 and 5, the contempt citation charges senior officials at the Department of Justice headquarters ultimately approved and authorized Operation Fast and Furious. However, the contempt citation fails to mention the committee has uncovered no evidence that DOJ officials, including the Attorney General, ever approved or authorized gun walking on Operation Fast and Furious. In fact, the authorization originated in the ATF office in Phoenix, Arizona, not at DOJ headquarters in Washington. On pages 16, 17, 19, 20, 21, 22, 25, 26, and 27, the contempt citation charges DOJ with not producing a series of documents that the chairman only recently acknowledged the department is prohibited by law from providing due to the potential impact on ongoing prosecutions. In fact, I would ask the gentleman for an extra 20 seconds.
I'd yield the gentleman an extra 15 seconds.
In fact, he had to amend his own subpoenas to delete documents in this very category, but his contempt citation has not caught up with his most recent version of his subpoena. Clearly, the majority has not taken the necessary time to properly weigh this very serious charge. Regrettably, this deeply flawed and shoddy contempt citation is emblematic of the majority's reckless rush to judgment throughout this political prosecution. I've been deeply troubled by the tone and tenor of some of the very hostile questioning and the utter and complete contempt and lack of respect given to the Attorney General of the United States. When this chapter of congressional history is written, it will be not a brave, shining moment. It will be seen for what it is, a craven, crass, partisan move that brings dishonor to this body, and I yield back.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The gentleman from California.
I now yield 1 minute to the very distinguished and very often, always participating member of the committee from New York, Ms. Burkle.
Gentlelady from New York is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the chairman for his steadfast work on behalf of truth and trying to get to the bottom of Fast and Furious. Mr. Speaker, Syracuse, New York, in the heart of my district, is roughly 2,500 miles from Rico, Arizona, where U.S. Border Patrol agent Brian Terry was tragically shot and killed by an AK-47 assault rifle that the United States knowingly allowed into the hands of a suspected gun trafficker. Yet every time I'm home, it is the issue first and foremost on the minds of my constituents. I listen to their calls, to their emails at our town halls. They want to know what happened, who knew what, and when did they know it. They ask me, they ask Washington, they ask the Department of Justice, how could the United States government, the pillar of hope and freedom, allowed for this, for one of their own representatives, one of their own good guys, to be so helplessly gunned down by a suspected criminal? Mr. Speaker, I'm embarrassed to say that after 562 days, I still don't have an answer for them.
Time the gentlelady has.
May I have 1 more minute?
I yield the gentlelady an additional 10 seconds.
Gentlelady is recognized for 10 seconds.
Mr. Speaker, I ask, is this the hope that the Americans were supposed to believe in out of the supposedly most transparent government in the history of our nation? It is my hope, Mr. Speaker, that the district court judge will see through the Attorney General's contempt of Congress after it is passed in the House today. However, we must not be mistaken that even if the Attorney General is prosecuted, the case is not closed. We must not forget that guns leaked through this program.
Time of the gentlelady has expired.
Do I have another minute?
I'd yield the gentlelady an additional 10 seconds.
Gentlelady is recognized for 10 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, after today's vote, we must continue our efforts to find more answers than there are questions relating to this administration's catastrophic Fast and Furious. The American people deserve to know those answers, and the family of Border Patrol agent Brian Terry as well. Thank you. I yield back.
Time of the gentlelady has expired. The gentleman from Maryland.
I yield the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Clay, 2 minutes, a member of the committee.
Gentleman from Missouri is recognized for 2 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, as a member of the Oversight Committee, I know that the gun walking operations conducted by the ATF under both the previous and current administrations were absolutely wrong. But the leadership of this House is focused on shameful election year political posturing instead of the real issue. The Justice Department long ago ended the practice of allowing these guns to walk across the border, putting communities in Mexico at great risk. But the same people who have relentlessly pursued a baseless partisan attack on Attorney General Holder and the President have ignored the desperate pleas of the Mexican government to strengthen American gun laws and curb the gun trafficking that gave rise to the strategy in the first place. But focusing on the real issue would take time away from their playing politics with the oversight authority. Those on the other side of the aisle claim to be concerned about powerful assault weapons crossing the border into Mexico illegally. But how can they be completely fine with those same powerful assault weapons being sold right here in this country legally, putting our communities at even greater risk? This is nothing more than a political witch hunt. The disgraceful posturing that I have witnessed at last week's markup has been continued on the floor today. I agree that it never should have come to this, but we are here debating this resolution solely because of the majority. They created the scandal and produced the showdown during an election season just to smear an honorable, dedicated public servant and to embarrass his boss. I urge my colleagues to reject this nakedly partisan, unprecedented abuse.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The gentleman from California.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's now my honor to yield 1 minute to the distinguished Speaker of the House, John Boehner.
The gentleman from Ohio, the Speaker of the House, is recognized.
I want to thank my colleague for yielding. It's important for the American people to know how we got here and to know the facts of this case. The Congress asked the Justice Department for the facts related to the Fast and Furious and the events that led to the death of U.S. Border Patrol agent Brian Terry. The Justice Department did not provide the facts and the information that we requested. Instead, the information came from people outside the department, people who wanted to do the right thing. In addition to not providing the information, the administration admitted misleading Congress, actually retracting a letter it had sent 10 months earlier. I think all the members understand this is a very serious matter. The Terry family wants to know how this happened, and they have every right to have their answers. And the House needs to know how this happened, and it's our constitutional duty to find out. So the House Oversight and Government Reform Committee issued a lawful and narrowly tailored subpoena. We've been patient, given the Justice Department every opportunity to comply so that we can get to the bottom of this for the Terry family. We've shown more than enough good faith, but the White House has chosen to invoke executive privilege. That leaves us no other options. The only recourse left for the House is to continue seeking the truth and to hold Attorney General in contempt of Congress. Now, I don't take this matter lightly, and I would frankly hoped it would never come to this. The House's focus is on jobs and on the economy. But no Justice Department is above the law, and no Justice Department is above the Constitution, which each of us has sworn an oath to uphold. So I ask the members of this body to come together and to support this resolution so that we can seek the answers that the Terry family and the American people deserve. I yield back.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The gentleman from Maryland.
Let me just say before Mr. Lynch, I yield myself 1 minute.
Gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
I want to say in response to the Speaker, we too are all saddened by the tragic death of Border Patrol Agent Brian Terry, who gave his life service to his country on December 15, 2010. But, Mr. Speaker, despite that what my colleagues have claimed, this contempt vote is not about getting documents that show how gun walking was initiated and utilized in Operation Fast and Furious. Now, the only documents in dispute are documents created after Fast and Furious ended and after Brian Terry's death. But we pledge to continue to find all the answers with regard to the death of Brian Terry. With that, I yield the distinguished gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Lynch, 2 minutes. Member of the committee.
The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would add that we had 31 Democrats that signed a letter to the Department of Justice and to the White House in the aftermath of Agent Terry's death to fully cooperate in this investigation. However, I rise in strong opposition to this contempt resolution. While criticism of the Department of Justice for oversight of the so-called gun-walking operations conducted during both the Bush administration and the current administration, criticism may be warranted, a finding of contempt against the sitting Attorney General of the United States is most certainly not. In determining whether this House should hold our highest-ranking national law enforcement officer in contempt of Congress, let us remember that up until last week, the majority of our committee had been demanding the production of documents that our Attorney General is legally prohibited from disclosing. And that has caused much of the delay here. In other words, Mr. Holder would have broken the law and likely compromised existing criminal prosecutions if he adhered to the majority's unreasonable request for materials related to ongoing criminal investigations, federal wiretap communications, and under judicial seal, and documents also subject to grand jury secrecy rules. Let us also be mindful that we are considering the extent of cooperation or non-cooperation of an Attorney General who has appeared before Congress on 9 separate occasions, whose Justice Department has produced over 7,600 pages of documents to oversight investigators, and who continues to offer significant accommodations in response to extraordinary and ever-changing requests for information. Meanwhile, the majority continues to deny any and all Democratic requests to publicly question, under oath, law enforcement officials, including former Director of the ATF, Ken Melson, the head of the very agency that ran the gun-walking operations such as Fast and Furious. Accordingly, it's become quite clear that what began as a legitimate and compelling oversight committee investigation into Operation Fast and Furious has deteriorated into an unfortunate example.
Gentleman, another 15 seconds.
The gentleman is recognized for 15 seconds.
In closing, I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to oppose this contempt resolution, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back his time. The gentleman from California.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Wahlberg.
The gentleman from Michigan is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Speaker. There is no joy in today's action. But the fact remains, 18 months after U.S. Border Patrol agent Brian Terry was murdered, the Justice Department has failed to hold anybody accountable for the mistakes of Operation Fast and Furious. As a member of the Oversight and Government Reform Committee, I have witnessed firsthand the stonewalling by the Department of Justice and Attorney General Holder. At every question, the Justice Department has refused to acknowledge what they know about the gun-walking tactics that led to Agent Terry's death. Most recently, they have hid behind the President's erroneous claims of executive privilege, an action the President denounced as lacking transparency when he was campaigning. The Department has stood in open defiance of Congress's moral and constitutional obligation to conduct oversight of this affair. The family of Agent Terry deserves to know who approved Fast and Furious. They have the right to know who had the power to stop this program before he was murdered. And they need an explanation as to why the Department of Justice took 9 months to withdraw their false denial that they had ever let gun walk to Mexico. To some on the other side of this aisle.
Time of the gentleman has expired.
30 seconds. I yield the gentleman an additional 15 seconds.
The gentleman is recognized for 15 seconds.
To some on the other side of the aisle, it seems fine that the people who authorize this operation still work within the Department of Justice. I don't agree. They'd rather play politics than uphold Congress's right to investigate. Today's vote is about accountability. It's about making sure another 2,000 firearms don't end up in the hands of Mexican drug cartels. And it's about bringing closure to the Terry family. I urge my colleagues to support this resolution and honor the memory of Brian Terry.
Time of the gentleman has expired. Gentleman from Maryland.
Speaker, I yield to distinguished gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Hoyer, 4 minutes.
The gentleman from Maryland, the minority whip, is recognized for 4 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, this is a sad day for the House of Representatives. It is an irresponsible day for the House of Representatives. It is a day in which the majority party asks us to take an action that has never been taken in the history of America. Never once. Holding a cabinet officer in contempt of the Congress. Now, there have been previous contempt citations, some promoted by Democratic committees and some promoted by Republican committees. The average time between committee action and consideration on the floor of this House is 87 days. Time to reflect on an extraordinarily important action with consequences beyond the knowledge of anybody sitting here today. Now, I want to tell the chairman, with all due respect, I think this investigation has been extraordinarily superficial. I think the chairman has failed to call witnesses that could, in fact, give relevant, cogent testimony on the issues to bear. That ought to be done. That is why I will strongly support the motion of the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Dingell, who has served here longer than any of the rest of us, and who is one of the strongest gun control rights supporters in this Congress. And what his motion says is, let us reflect. Let us bring thoughtful judgment. Let us not, every time that there is the opportunity, to choose confrontation over cooperation and consensus. That has been the history of this Congress. Confrontation over consensus every time. And America is suffering because of it. I ask my friends on the Republican side of the aisle who know me to be a bipartisan member of this body that believes in this institution and who cares about its actions and the precedent they will set. Don't do this. Vote for this motion to refer. Give the chairman the opportunity he should have taken before to have a full hearing, calling former Attorney General McCaskey, calling the former head of the ATF, calling agents who were personally involved in this proceeding. I venture to say that there are very few members who will vote on this issue who have read the committee proceedings. Very few members who have read the minority report or the majority report. Yet they are about to take a historic vote to do what has never been done by any Congress. 111 Congresses did not take this action. This is not about Republicans or Democrats. This is about our Constitution, our country, our respect for a nation of laws, not of men. That's what this vote is about. We ought not to be voting as Republicans and Democrats. We ought to be voting as Americans. Americans committed to justice and fair process. I regret that I do not believe this committee has followed that. I believe that the political motivations behind this resolution are clear and pose a clear and present danger to this nation. I have 30 additional seconds.
Grant the gentleman 30 additional seconds.
The gentleman is recognized for 30 seconds.
I want to thank the gentleman from Maryland, my colleague and my friend, for his leadership on this effort. When we vote on this referral, let us vote as Americans, as I said, not as a partisan issue. You may have the Attorney General in the future. It's not the question of the party of the Attorney General. It is the question of whether or not this Congress is going to provide for equal treatment of all Attorney Generals and all Cabinet officers. Let us vote for this motion to refer and give the committee the opportunity it should take. And let us vote down this motion.
Time of the gentleman
if
has
that
expired.
should fail. And let us vote down these motions for contempt. And let us thoughtfully consider the equities of this issue.
Time of the gentleman has expired.
And Mr. Speaker, I now yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, now my honor to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Arizona, an active participant and from the district from which this event sprung, Mr. Gozar.
Gentleman from Arizona is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, finding Attorney General Eric Holder Jr. in contempt of Congress is long overdue, but welcome news from the American people and especially for Arizonans. As I explained in my recent statement, Mr. Holder has shown his contempt and utter disdain for our constitutional rights, our border, Arizonans, and all Americans. 115 members of Congress agree that Americans lack confidence in Mr. Holder and his department. Every member of Congress should do their constitutional duty and hold the Attorney General in contempt today. The people of Arizona, California, New Mexico, and Texas, who deal with the unsecured borders and violent Mexican cartels on a regular basis, now must also live in fear of these firearms. Some have said that these charges against Attorney General Eric Holder are racially motivated, and I couldn't disagree more. The violent cartels armed by our government have no regard for party ID, or race. Throughout our nation, and specifically in Arizona, folks from all political parties and all races are now living in danger of this lethal violence due to the actions of this administration. Make no mistakes about it. Today's vote is to deliver justice and accountability for the Brian Terry family and the over 300 Mexicans who have died as a result of Fast and Furious.
Time the gentleman has expired.
Time's up. I yield.
Gentleman from Maryland.
Yield the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Hoyer, 30 seconds.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. On November 1st, 2009, our Speaker stood on this floor, outraged about the process. We too are outraged about this process, and let me quote the Speaker: "We will not stand for this." And I would ask my House Republican colleagues and those who believe that we should be here protecting the American people, protecting our Constitution, not vote on this bill. Let's just get up and leave. My colleagues may well follow that advice. I yield back.
Time of the gentleman has expired. Gentleman from California.
I yield myself 10 seconds and have no doubt that the gentleman will walk off the floor, but his motion is asking us also to delay into an election getting an answer for the Terry family. I know that is not the wise course, and I strongly support that we do this today. And with that, I would yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Idaho, Mr. Labrador.
The gentleman from Idaho is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I stand with a heavy heart in support of today's contempt resolution. It puts us another step closer to holding the Attorney General accountable for this severely flawed operation and his failure to cooperate with Congress. The Attorney General has not only failed to produce all the relevant documents, he has misled this Congress and thereby prevented us from uncovering the truth. So how can the members of the minority say that our investigation is superficial when we don't even have all the documents? When the Attorney General was before the Committee on Oversight last year, I brought to light his historical pattern of willful ignorance, highlighting his lack of knowledge when under oath. He knows nothing, he says nothing, and he seeks for nothing. Never in my life have I met a man more unconcerned with the search for the truth. I've since become even more disturbed by the depth to which Mr. Holder and his allies will sink to stonewall justice. Yes, this is an unprecedented day. I agree with you. But not until now have we had an Attorney General have to retract so many statements made to Congress of the United States, the duly elected representatives of the people of the United States. Let us vote to support this motion for contempt, and I yield my time.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Maryland.
Mr. Speaker, may I inquire as to how much time both sides have?
The gentleman from Maryland has 6 1/4 minutes remaining. The gentleman from California has 11 1/4 minutes remaining.
I grant to Ms. Maloney 2 minutes.
Gentlelady from New York is recognized for 2 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, the family of Brian Terry deserves our respect, our condolences, and our best efforts to finish the mission, to put an end to gun violence on the southern border. But instead of going after gun violence, this investigation has gone after the man that tried to stop the gun violence, the Attorney General. Chairman Issa has acknowledged that Attorney General Holder did not know about the gun walking operation. He has acknowledged that the President and the White House did not know about the gun walking operation. Both the White House and the Attorney General have acknowledged that the gun walking operation was a tragic mistake, that it was badly executed, and that it originated under the Bush administration. It was Attorney General Holder that terminated the program and requested an extensive investigation of the operation and how it was conducted. And the documents that they are now requesting in this vast and spurious investigation have absolutely nothing to do with gun walking. If they were really interested in discovering the truth, the committee would have called Kenneth Melson, head of the ATF, as a witness. The chairman refused 10 different requests for a hearing with Mr. Melson. 10 requests. Republicans have not granted one single Democratic witness request in 16 months. Not one. This is not about discovering the truth. This is about politics. This has become an obsessive political vendetta, pursuing a political agenda in a season of unusually ugly politics. If they were serious about ending gun violence, they would do what many ATF agents have suggested and put some teeth in the law. And that is why I authored with my colleagues a bill to make gun trafficking a federal offense and strengthen penalties for straw purchases. This unprecedented contempt citation is politics at its worst, and why this body is held in such low esteem by the
Time, the gentlelady has expired. The gentleman from California.
Thank you, Speaker. I ask unanimous consent that the statement by the Terry family regarding Congressman John Dingell's criticism of the contempt vote be placed in the record at this time.
Without objection, it will be placed in the record.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'm sure the gentlelady from New York recognizes that the right of a minority hearing has not been exercised, and that would have answered the questions, as they are well aware, about bringing Kenneth Melson before the committee. That would be their right. They did not exercise their right. With that, I yield a minute to the gentleman from Florida, the senior member of the committee, Mr. Mica.
Gentleman from Florida is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you for yielding. When the Founding Fathers created our government and established the committees in Congress, they had authorizing committees and they had appropriating committees. In 1808, the predecessor of this committee was established for a fundamental reason, and that's to make certain that programs and funding were properly executed and used by agencies created by Congress. Congress created the law that created the Department of Justice. Congress funded the programs that are under the Department of Justice. It's our responsibility to investigate when things go wrong. And things went wrong. an agent of the United States was murdered with weapons which were funded by the agency that we created. All we have asked for is the documents. All we want are the facts, and we have been thwarted. Eric Holder, Attorney General of the United States, the highest judicial enforcement officer of the United States, has been in contempt, is in contempt, and is showing contempt for the Congress and the responsibility under the Constitution of this important committee of Congress. I urge adoption of a contempt resolution against the Attorney General.
Time has expired.
Yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Maryland.
Mr. Speaker, I grant the gentleman from California, Mr. Schiff, 2 minutes.
The gentleman from California is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I rise in strong opposition to these contempt resolutions. I spent 6 years as an assistant U.S. attorney, and I have great admiration and respect for the hardworking men and women of the department. I have great respect for our Attorney General, who I think has been a superb Attorney General and is a man of great integrity. And I, like most Americans, would like to know about the facts of Fast and Furious, about the problem of guns crossing our border, the horrendous violence the south of our border. But what we do today will shed no light on that. What we do today will not improve the situation in terms of gun violence that's claimed the lives of tens of thousands of Mexican citizens and claims lives of increasing numbers of Americans. What we are doing today is simply a partisan abuse of the contempt power. 13% of the American people think highly of Congress, and today those 13% are wondering why. What we do will cause no injury to the department, but it will cause great injury to this House. The Justice Department, after providing 8,000 documents and extensive testimony, is now being required to turn over privileged materials. And like all administrations before it, it has reluctantly used the executive privilege to respectfully refuse to provide materials it cannot provide. And so now we are here bringing a contempt motion against an Attorney General, which our committee chairman acknowledges was not aware of Fast and Furious. They don't expect any documents to show he was aware of Fast and Furious, and yet we're going to hold this cabinet official in contempt? That is an outrageous abuse of the contempt power. What will happen when the Congress actually needs to use the contempt power for a legitimate purpose? Will anyone still recognize it? I urge the Speaker to withdraw this motion, as indeed Speaker Gingrich withdrew the motion in his day, and let the parties work this out. We both know, Democrats and Republicans, how this will end. It will end with a settlement in court months or years from now, with the Department providing the same documents they're offering to provide today. Let's end this partisan exercise now.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The gentleman from California.
I yield myself 15 seconds.
The gentleman is recognized for 15 seconds.
I respect my colleague from California. We came into Congress together some 12 years ago. But the fact is, he talked about everything except the fact that Congress was lied to in a false letter and follow-up statement. 10 months went by, and we're only asking for the information related to the false statements made to Congress during that intervening period, and nothing more. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. The gentleman reserves his time. Gentleman from Maryland.
I yield to the leader, Ms. Pelosi, 30 seconds. 1 minute, I'm sorry.
The gentlelady from California, minority leader, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the gentleman for yielding. I commend him for his extraordinary patriotism, for his commitment to upholding our oath of office to protect and defend the Constitution, and for recognizing full well the congressional role of oversight of all branches of government. I think we all share that view, that Congress has a legitimate role to play in oversight, and thus your committee has so much jurisdiction, and I respect that. I think we all also agree, I think we all very, very much agree that we are very sad and seek justice for the family of Border Patrol Agent Brian Terry. His loss is a tragedy for all who knew him, for all of us who care about him, and we offer our condolences to his family. So sad. But that's not what we're here to debate. What we agree upon? What we're here to debate is something very, very large, because it is a major disagreement between the two sides of the aisle here, and I'm sorry to say that, about what our responsibilities are to the Constitution of the United States. The Constitution says it requires Congress and the executive branch to avoid unnecessary conflict and to seek accommodations that serve both their interest. That's how the Constitution guides us. As Attorney General William French Smith, who served under President Ronald Reagan, said, "The accommodation required is not simply an exchange of concessions or a test of political strength. It is an obligation of each branch to make a principled effort to acknowledge and, if possible, to meet the legitimate needs of the other branch." Mr. Speaker, on the floor today, the Republicans in Congress are not making a principled effort to acknowledge or meet the legitimate needs of the other branch. What they are doing is exploiting a very unfortunate circumstance for reasons that I cannot even characterize, so I won't. But I will say this, without any fear of contradiction. The basic premise that this debate is predicated on today is a false premise. It is factually not true. How many more ways can I say that? And so we have a debate predicated on a false premise, and what can that lead to that has any good outcome? It is a situation where we have a contempt of Congress resolution against a sitting cabinet member, which is the first time in the over 200-year history of our country that this has ever happened. Again, what is the motivation? Secondly, and that's why I quoted the Constitution, this motion is not a principled effort to resolve the issue. If it were, we would not be able to measure in hours and days, not even weeks, the rush, the railroading of a resolution of contempt of Congress that the Republicans passed last week and are bringing this week to the House floor. I say this because I took considerable heat myself when we brought contempt charges against two staff people at the White House, Josh Bolton and Harriet Miers, 4.5 years ago. We were asking for some papers. We got nothing. As I say to my friends, not even a wrapper off of a piece of gum. Nothing. Stonewall. Nothing. And yet, our chairman at the time of the Judiciary Committee, Mr. Conyers, and our House leadership, Mr. Hoyer and others, kept saying, find a way, exhaust every remedy, so that we do not have to take this action of bringing a contempt charge to the floor of the House. For over 200 days, we tried to resolve the situation. And when we could not, we brought it to the floor, two staff people at the White House. In stark contrast to the rush of 1 week to the next, for an unsubstantiated, not even factual charge against the Attorney General of the United States. It may just be a coincidence, I don't know, that the Attorney General of the United States, the chief legal officer of our country, has a responsibility to fight voter suppression, which is going on in our country, that he has refused to defend the constitutionality of DOMA because he doesn't believe it's constitutional, or that has major disagreements on immigration, which falls under enforcement of immigration law. It may just be a coincidence that those are part of his responsibilities. Or maybe it isn't. But the fact is that the chief legal officer of our country and his staff has to spend enormous energy, psychic, intellectual, and time dealing with this unprincipled effort on the part of the Republicans. Just when you think you have seen it all, just when you think they couldn't possibly go any further over the edge, they come up with something like this. It's stunning. It really is. And I don't mean that in meaning it's beautiful. It's stunning. It stops you in your tracks because you say, how far will they go? Have they no limits? Apparently not. And so the temptation is to say, let's just ignore the whole thing, to not dignify what they are doing by even being present on the floor when they do this heinous act. First time in history of our country to bring a contempt against a cabinet officer. You would think they'd be more careful about what they say. But being careful about what they say is apparently not part of their agenda. And so I know in our caucus there's a mixed response to this. They're acting politically. We should act politically. We shouldn't vote on this. I want to vote no. I think members have to make their own decision about that. I'm very moved by the efforts of our Congressional Black Caucus to say that they're going to walk out on this. Walk out on this. And perhaps that's the best approach for us to take. How else can we impress upon the American people without scaring them about what is happening here? What is happening here? What is happening here is shameful. What is happening here is something that we all have an obligation to speak out against. Because I'm telling you, it's Eric Holder today, it's anybody else tomorrow, any charge they can drum up. And the fact is, and has been said, the fact is that the papers that they have seen, they know, are exculpatory. That means there is no blame on the Attorney General. And they know that. And that's why they don't want to bring those responsible for this before their committee. And that's why I commend Chairman Dingell for his leadership in the motion that he will bring to the floor momentarily, a motion of referral, so that we can get to the bottom of this, so that we can see how this happened, so that we can offer some solace to Brian Terry's family, and so that we can have some sense of decency about what should happen on the floor of the House. And when it goes, it seems to me the more baseless the charge, the higher up they want to go with the contempt. The less they have to say that is real, the higher up they want to bring the contempt charge. I have always tried to make it a habit of not questioning the motivation of people. They believe what they believe. We believe what we believe, and we act upon our beliefs. It always interested me that in this Congress somebody can bring something to the floor that is not true. But if I were to call someone a misrepresenter of that information, my words would be taken down. So I guess that gives them liberty to say anything, because it's in the form of emotion. But let's make sure that we all take responsibility for doing the right thing by not letting there be an abuse of power, an abuse of this floor of the House, an abuse of the time of the executive branch, an abuse of a member of the time of a member of the cabinet who has serious responsibilities to our country. So I urge my colleagues to do what they want as far as walking off. I myself had said that I was coming to this floor to vote against this resolution. I thought it was so wrong that there was no question to take the opportunity to vote no. But listening to the debate, almost unbelievable. Not that what they're saying is believable, but unbelievable that they would say it. And so now I say to those who have a doubt about how they want to proceed, that instead of doing what I said before, which was just to come and treat this as an act of a bill before the Congress, a resolution before the Congress, and express my no, listening to the unconscionable presentation, I want to join my TBC colleagues in boycotting the vote when we have the walkout after we have the debate over Mr. Dingell's. We all take our responsibilities seriously here, and one of them, first and foremost, is to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. And that Constitution requires the Congress and the executive branch, I'll end as I began, to avoid unnecessary conflict and seek accommodation to serve both interests, the executive branch and the legislative branch. We are not upholding that aspect of the Constitution here. So I urge my colleagues to vote no or no vote, but to seriously reject. And let's hope that this will not be repeated. But I'm telling you, it's Eric Holder one day, you don't know who it is the next, because of the frivolousness which would they treat a serious responsibility of the House of Representatives. It's appalling. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlelady yields back her time. The gentleman from California.
As I know, the former Speaker of the House knows, the Attorney General is being held in contempt as the custodian of the records for refusing to deliver them, and not because we got to choose how far up or not up to go. With that, I would recognize the gentleman from Utah, Mr. Chaffetz, for 1 minute.
Gentleman from Utah is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Leader Pelosi seriously questioned our motivations here. Let me be crystal clear what my motivation is. We have a dead United States agent. We have more than 200 dead people in Mexico. We have more than 2,000 weapons that were knowingly, willfully given to the drug cartels. More than 1,000 of those weapons are still missing. Most of them are AK-47s. We have a duly issued subpoena that has not been responded to. On February 4th, 2011, on Department of Justice letterhead, they presented the United States Congress a letter that was a lie. It took them nearly 9 to 10 months to provide that information and say, whoops, sorry. That's not good enough. This is not about Eric Holder. This is about the Department of Justice and justice in the United States of America. And I would hearken back to the June 3rd, 2011 letter that 31 Democrats, brave Democrats, sent to the White House. I read part of this. Quote, "It is equally troubling." Remember, this is about over a year ago. "It is equally troubling that the Department of Justice has delayed action and withheld information from congressional inquiries." End quote. He went on to say, quote, "While the Department of Justice can and should continue its investigation, those activities should not curtail the ability of Congress to fulfill its oversight duty. We urge you to instruct the Department of Justice to promptly provide complete answers to all congressional inquiries on this issue."
An additional 15 seconds.
The gentleman is recognized for 15 seconds.
Nothing's changed in over a year, but I can tell you what, the Brian Terry doesn't have answers. You don't have answers. I don't have answers. I want all the facts. That's what we're asking for today. The facts. All of them. I yield back.
Time of the gentleman has expired.
Remind the gentleman that all of this gun walking started under President Bush.
The gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
I reserve.
Gentleman from Maryland reserves his time. Gentleman from California.
I'd recognize myself for 10 seconds. The distinguished gentleman from Maryland can have an opinion, but he can't have his facts. Fast and Furious was an OCDETH operation that began under President Obama and Attorney General Holder. No ifs, no ands, no buts, and I would trust that the gentleman would no longer make statements that would be less than truthful, and I reserve.
Gentleman reserves his time.
15 seconds. Again, the gentleman puts out statements in search of facts. Thank you. I reserve.
Gentleman reserves his time.
With that, I recognize the former chairman of the Oversight Committee, the distinguished gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Burton, for 1 minute.
Gentleman from Indiana is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, gentleman, for yielding. There's been a lot of hyperbole and a lot of repetition, but a lot of the things that have been said haven't really been factual. So let's look at the facts. Brian Terry was murdered. Hundreds of people have been murdered in Mexico with guns that went across the border. The Justice Department said in February of 2011 they had no knowledge about this, and then 10 months later they admitted they lied. Now, they said they didn't know, and then they said they said they did. Now, I don't know what you call that, but to me it's a lie. Then Chairman Issa tried again and again to get information so we could get to the bottom of this, like the 32 Democrats wanted, and they refused. He sent subpoenas. They refused. They hid behind this being an ongoing investigation, and they couldn't give those documents. We got a fraction of the documents that should have been given to us, but they wouldn't do that. Issa met with the Attorney General's people to try to come to some conclusion, some kind of a resolution of this, so that we wouldn't have to move the contempt citation. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. And then finally, at the 11th hour, when we knew that we were going to have to move with the contempt citation, the President of the United States issues an executive order claiming executive privilege. Something is funny.
Give the gentleman yield the gentleman an additional 30 seconds.
The gentleman is recognized for 30 seconds.
Something is wrong. There's just no question. Something is being hidden from the Congress and the American people. And no matter how much is being said here tonight, the fact of the matter is we aren't getting the information. A Border Patrol agent's been killed, maybe 2. Hundreds of people have been killed in Mexico with American guns that our government knew was going across that border, and the Attorney General has not been giving us the information. The Justice Department has been hiding it from the Congress and the American people, and the President has claimed executive privilege. If that doesn't tell you something, nothing will. I yield back.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The gentleman from Maryland.
I reserve.
The gentleman reserves his time. The gentleman from California.
Mr. Speaker, I'd inquire on how much time is remaining.
The gentleman from California has 6½ minutes remaining, and the gentleman from Maryland has 1¼ minutes remaining.
Thank you. I'd ask unanimous consent at this time to place into the record letters dated May 24th, 2012, May 30th, 2012, and June 1st, 2012, all addressed to Elijah Cummings, ranking member of the committee.
Without objection, they'll appear in the record.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I now would yield to the gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Lankford, 1 minute.
The gentleman from Oklahoma is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is a truly sad day. This is not stunning, as I've heard. This is a deliberative process that we tried to work through. We have a border agent that's been killed. We have hundreds of Mexicans that have been killed. And the fingerprints on all that go straight back to an operation that was done by the federal government. This is a moment to get all the facts, to get it on the table, to find out what happened, and to get it done. Now, we started with a subpoena process over 22 different categories. We narrowed that down to one. How do we get the documents from the time of February the 4th of last year when the Department of Justice told us one thing, and December when they said, oops, and changed their story? We found out they had not told us the truth, and in that time period when they stalled, we just want the information on that. How did this occur? This is essential because Phoenix ATF had a plan, fast and furious. It was then approved by the U.S. Attorney in that area and then went up the food chain to Department of Justice where it was signed off. This is not irrelevant. This is essential that we know the process of how this was done. If we're going to fix this problem, we've got to know the facts. Instead, they're being withheld. With that, I yield back.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The gentleman from Maryland.
Continue to reserve.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from California.
Speaker, point of inquiry, do I have the right to close?
The gentleman from California has a right to close.
Then I will reserve my right to close.
Gentleman from Maryland.
Have any more speakers?
No, I do not.
Mr. Speaker, as the Democratic leader said, there is no doubt that the Constitution gives Congress the right and responsibility to investigate. But the Constitution also requires something else. It requires Congress and the executive branch to avoid unnecessary conflict and to seek accommodations that serve both of their interests. In this case, the Attorney General has testified 9 times. He has provided thousands of pages of documents. He's provided 13 pages of deliberative internal documents, and he is willing to provide even more to meet the recent demands of Chairman Issa. But House Republican leaders are not honoring their constitutional obligations. In fact, they are running in the wrong direction as quickly as possible. It is fundamentally wrong to vote in favor of this resolution at this time when the Attorney General has been working with the House in good faith. I believe this action will undermine the standing of the House, will cement the Speaker's legacy, and will be recorded by history as a discredit to this institution. With that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back his time. The gentleman from California.
I recognize myself for such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized for as much time as he may consume.
Mr. Speaker, there's been a lot talked about here about documents that the Attorney General couldn't give us. These documents under seal would be an example of documents that we should not see except in camera. And we've taken great care to ensure that no one outside members of Congress and key staff have ever looked at them. But I've looked at them, and what I know is that these documents, read by any person of ordinary learning, make it very clear that these wiretap applications read and signed by individuals in the Department of Justice in Washington, you read them, you knew they were gun walking. People will tell you differently. I give you my word. You read this, you know they were letting guns go to Mexico. They knew who the buyers were, who the intermediaries were, who the recipients were, and most importantly, where they ended up. And there were reports in here as part of evidence given to judges in order to get wiretaps. There were evidence that they knew that, in fact, weapons had already ended up in Mexico. That's before Brian Terry was killed. That's where Fast and Furious could have been stopped. That's where people could have been warned. In fact, that's why at a time in which ATF agents in Mexico City, if they punched in the serial number of a weapon found there, they got an error. They did not get meaningful information because that was being blocked, not by ATF per se, but by the Department of Justice under the auspices of the U.S. Attorney and his bosses. Now, you're going to hear that this began under President Bush. Attorney General McCasey, I'm going to tell you that's just false. What happened in previous administrations with some of the same local ATF agents was they exercised extremely bad judgment. They did things and pushed on programs that I believe were poorly conceived and poorly manned, and as a result, they lost track of weapons repeatedly. That happened, and it was wrong. The U.S. Attorney at the time even declined prosecutions because of failed techniques. All of these were shut down during the Bush administration. President Bush can take no credit for it. He didn't know it. As far as I know, the Attorney General didn't know. And anyone who saw the record of that should say this was wrong-minded. But during this administration, during the time in which the Attorney General and his key lieutenants, including Lanny Brewer, were in charge, they reopened the prosecutions from a failed program called Wide Receiver, and they opened Fast and Furious. Now, I'm the second child in a family. I have an older brother, and I learned at a very young age, you in fact cannot, when you do something wrong, say, my brother Billy did it. It doesn't work that way. You're responsible for what you do wrong, whether it happened before your watch or not. This happened on the Attorney General's watch. But that's not why we're here today. We're here because when we asked legitimate questions about Brian Terry's murder, about Fast and Furious, we were lied to. We were lied to repeatedly and over a 10-month period. The fact is, that is what we're here for. The American people want to know that if you give false testimony to Congress, and the minority leader talked about why is there such a hurry? Why was there 10 months delay? I was sworn in just a few days before this investigation began, and now we're nearing an election, and we don't want to have this during an election. We want to have resolution for the Terry family. The important thing is we know enough to know that we have people who have told us under penalty of criminal prosecution, they have told Congress and their employees certain documents exist, and we've asked for those documents, and we've been denied them. We can't bring Kenneth Melson back in good faith and say, well, we've got to have him in front of our committee. If, in fact, there's documents he says exist, and they do, and they will not be given to us, we want to have those so we can ask the best questions. You've heard earlier that, in fact, we've denied somehow due process to the minority. My ranking member is very capable and has asked for minority days, in other words, hearings exclusively for him. He chose not to do it. When we were having the local ATF and other individuals in early on, all of whom worked for this government, he didn't even ask for any. It wasn't until we asked to have the Attorney General come in based on these false statements and final retraction that he suddenly wanted a previous Attorney General who happened to say, no, I don't want to come. So on that particular day, we would have had to subpoena him to get him in. I have no objection to having the former Attorney General in. I believe that on his watch and his predecessor's watch and his predecessor's watch, and for a very long time, we have not done a good job of overseeing the actions of field agents when it comes to guns. But again, we're here today for the first time in over 200 years to deal with an Attorney General who has flat refused to give the information related to lies and a cover-up exclusively within his jurisdiction. Lies and a cover-up exclusively in his jurisdiction. That's what we're voting on. I urge vote on the contempt on behalf of the Terry family.
Time the gentleman has expired. All time for debate has expired. For what purpose does the gentleman from Michigan seek recognition?
I have a motion at the clerk's desk.
The clerk will report the motion.
Motion to refer House Resolution 711. Mr. Dingell of Michigan moves to refer the resolution, House Resolution 711, to the Committee on Oversight and Government Reform with instructions to 1. Hold a bipartisan public hearing with testimony from Kenneth Melson, the former acting director of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, during Operation Fast and Furious. 2. Hold a bipartisan public hearing with testimony from William Hoover, the former acting deputy director of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives during Operation Fast and Furious. 3. Hold a bipartisan public hearing with testimony from the former Attorney General Michael McCasey, who, according to documents produced to the committee, was informed during his tenure that although efforts to coordinate firearm interdictions with Mexican law enforcement officials in 2007 have not been successful, the ATF would like to expand such efforts. 4. Conduct a bipartisan transcribed interview of Alice Fisher, who served as the Assistant Attorney General for the Criminal Division of the Department of Justice from 2005 to 2008, about her role in authorizing wiretaps and Operation Wide Receiver. 5. Conduct a bipartisan transcribed interview of Kenneth Blanco, who serves as Deputy Assistant Attorney General at the Department of Justice and also authorized wiretaps in Operation Fast and Furious. 6. Take such further actions as the committee, with full bipartisan consultation, deems appropriate to assure a thorough and vigorous investigation of this matter.
Pursuant to House Resolution 708, the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Dingell, and the gentleman opposed will each control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Michigan.
I yield myself 4 minutes, asking unanimous consent for advisory to extend my remarks.
The gentleman is recognized and without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to offer this motion to refer so that this investigation can focus on the real issues at hand and to get the facts. I begin by expressing my respect and affection for the chairman of the committee, Mr. Issa, and I want to see a proper investigation, the facts gotten about serious misbehavior and utter incompetence at the at the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms and Explosives, called ATF. This is a tragedy. I have had the entirety of the motion read so that we could understand what a real investigation is. I didn't roll off the cabbage wagon yesterday, Mr. Speaker. I chaired committees for over 20 or 30 years, and I have conducted more investigations than any man in this particular body. It is clear that the events here were characterized by dishonest, evasive, and deceitful activities on the part of ATF personnel. I want to find out what has happened. This is not the first time I've crossed swords with ATF, and this is not the first time I have found them engaged in shameful, illegal, and improper behavior. In one instance, I caught them raiding the home of an individual. They shot him in the brains, and they pitched his wife in her underpants out into the hall. Operation Fast and Furious was a highly irresponsible operation that never should have occurred. People on both sides of this aisle agree to that. The American people want the answers, and they deserve to have a proper, thorough, and bipartisan investigation that gets them the truth. My constituent, Brian Terry, wants the truth from the grave, and his family asks that we get the truth. And with God as my judge, they deserve it, and they shall have it if I can get it for them. I've shared scores of investigations and hearings over 50 years on wrongdoing which have collected hundreds of millions of dollars wrongfully taken from our people, and which have caught more than a few serious wrongdoers who have paid proper penalties for their wrongdoing. These investigations were always bipartisan, with both sides of the aisle actively participating and fully informed. The actions of the committee were unanimously conducted and were supported by members on both sides of the aisle. What we see before us does not follow that model, and it brings no respect to this body. As someone who holds the institution here in the highest regard, I find this to be most troubling. Instead of going after the real answers and getting the facts about what has happened at ATF, the majority of the committee has engaged in what appears to be a partisan political witch hunt with the Attorney General as its target. Over the 16-month investigation, Democrats were not permitted to call a single witness to testify. So much for bipartisanship. The American people deserve better than this, Mr. Speaker. They deserve a legitimate inquiry based on facts in which all members of this body can support. Now, this is not a Second Amendment question. I have defended the Second Amendment more than any member of this body, and I am a past member of the board of directors of NRA and a life member of that body. We deserve, and the American people deserve, a legitimate inquiry based on the facts. It seems to me there's a simple way to resolve this dispute. First, adopt the resolution. Second, see to it that the Attorney General produces the documents that are currently at issue. And I will actively support the gentleman in seeing to it that those facts and those documents are presented. Second, the House Republicans should give a good faith commitment to work towards resolving the contempt fight. If the documents in fact are consistent with the Attorney General testimony, that he never authorized approved or knew about gun walking, then I think we should consider the matter of contempt resolved. If those documents...
Time of the gentleman expired.
I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves his time. The gentleman from California.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself 1 minute.
Does the gentleman claim time in opposition?
I claim time in opposition.
The gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
I thank the Speaker. I respect the gentleman from Michigan, the Dean of the House, but you're just wrong. There were plenty of opportunities for the minority to ask for witnesses. They chose not to except at one hearing, and then they wanted the former Attorney General. They did not avail themselves of the procedures allowing them to have a hearing, even though they know how to do it and have done it. But more importantly, when you say you represent Brian Terry, you do not. The Terry family issued this statement, which I ask unanimous consent be placed in the record.
Without objection, it will appear in the record.
Among the statements in there are, referring to Congressman Dingell, his views don't represent those of the Terry family, nor does he speak for the Terry family, and he has never spoken to the Terry family. Secondly, his office sent us a condolence letter when Brian Terry was buried 18 months ago. That's the last time we heard from him. Third, a year ago, after the Oversight and Government Reform Committee began its work, one of Brian Terry's sisters called Rep. Dingell's office seeking help and answers. No one from that office called back. Lastly, if Rep. Dingell truly wants to support the Terry family and honor Brian Terry, a son of Michigan, he and other members of Congress will call on the Attorney General to immediately provide documents requested by the House Oversight and Government Reform Committee. I reserve the balance of my time.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The gentleman reserve his time. The gentleman reserves his time. The gentleman from Michigan.
Well, I was aware of this. I have communicated with the family my sorrow at their loss, and my office is setting up a meeting with the Terry family as soon as I can get back to Michigan. My motion here would ensure that the witnesses the minority has requested, including the former director of ATM during the time of this operation, are called for a full, open, public hearing to assure that the American people get the whole story. I am not here solely representing the interests of the Terry family. I'm here representing the interests of the whole country and all of the 800, I don't yield to the gentleman, and all of the 800,000 people that I serve in the 15th District of Michigan. As I have said in a number of occasions in the last year, Congress has two choices in their decision making. We can work together and get something done, or we can play political football. I choose to get something done, which is why I have offered a resolution, and if you have listened to what I have had read by the clerk, you will observe that it says, we want a thorough, full, bipartisan investigation. That's the way the matter should be done. And members on this side will support the findings of that investigation if the chairman of that committee will permit this kind of undertaking to be begun. I would observe there's a very interesting fact. The contempt resolution is going to give the same instructions to the same fellow who is under contempt. He will simply put it in his pocket, and we will find that this body has been weakened in its dealings with the executive branch.
Gentleman from California is recognized.
I now yield all remaining time to the gentleman from South Carolina, an experienced prosecutor, to close.
Gentleman from South Carolina is recognized for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is a sad day, Mr. Speaker, for those of us who respect the rule of law as the foundation of this republic, for those of us who proudly work for the Department of Justice, for those of us who believe the same rules apply to everyone, regardless of whether they live simple lives of peace and quiet or whether they live and work in the towers of power, prestige, and authority, the same rules apply to everyone. It is the greatness of this country, Mr. Speaker. It is the greatness, the elegance, the simplicity of a woman who was blindfolded, holding nothing but a set of scales and a sword. The chief law enforcement official for this country is on the eve of being held in contempt of Congress because he refuses to follow the law. He refuses to allow Congress to find the truth, the whole truth. For those of you who want a negotiation, a compromise, an extraordinary accommodation, to use the Attorney General's words, for those of you who want a plea bargain, my question to you is simply this: will you settle for 75% of the truth? Is 50% of the truth enough for you? Is a third? Or do you want it all? Because if you want all the truth, then you want all the documents. If you've ever sat down, Mr. Speaker, with the parents who have lost a child, who has been murdered, and some of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle have been there, it is a humbling, emotional, life-altering experience. All they want is the truth. They want answers, they want justice, and they don't want part of it. They want all of it. And I will not compromise, Mr. Speaker, when it comes to finding the truth. Congress is right to pursue this no matter where it takes us. No matter which administration was in power, and no matter what the facts are, we are right to pursue this. And we are wrong if we settle for anything less than all the facts. To my colleagues who are voting no, Mr. Speaker, let me ask this. Can you tell me, can you tell the American people why the Department of Justice approved this lethal, fatally flawed operation? To those of you who are voting no, can you tell the American people how the tactic of gun walking was sanctioned? To those of you who are voting no, can you tell Brian Terry's family and friends how a demonstrably false letter was written on Department of Justice letterhead on February the 4th, and where would we be if we accepted that letter at face value? A letter written on Department of Justice letterhead. That is not just another political cabinet agency. It is emblematic of what we stand for as a country: truth, justice, the equal application of law to everyone. That letter was written on America stationery. That is what the Department of Justice is, and it was dead wrong. And where would we be if we took their word for it? Our fellow citizens have a right to know the truth, and we have an obligation to fight for it, Mr. Speaker. The politics be damned. We have a right to fight for it. I wish the Attorney General would give us the documents. I would rather have the documents than have this vote on contempt of Congress. But we cannot force him to do the right thing, and that does not relieve us of the responsibility for us to do the right thing. Even if the heavens may fall, Mr. Speaker, I want the truth. I want all of it. We should never settle for less than all of it, and we have to start today.
Time of the gentleman has expired. All time for debate on the motion has expired. Pursuant to House Resolution 708, the previous question is ordered on the motion. The question is on adoption of the motion. As many as are in favor will signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed will say no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
On that, I request the yeas and nays.
The yeas and nays are requested. Those in favor of vote by the yeas and nays will rise and be counted. A sufficient number having arisen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Members will record their vote by electronic device. This will be a 15-minute vote. It'll be followed by 5-minute votes on the motion to recommit if offered, adoption of the resolution if ordered, Motion to suspend H.R. 1447 if ordered. Motion to suspend H.R. 3173 if ordered. This is a 15-minute vote.